pain woke me before my eyes opened. A deep, grinding pain that started in my leg and moved through my whole body like a wave of fire. I tried to move, and something in my leg shifted the wrong way. I did not scream. My kind do not scream. We flash. My skin lit up in short, panicked pulses of blue light, the only voice my body had left in that first moment. I forced my eyes open. Smoke curled above me, gray against a sky the color of rust. Pieces of my shuttle were scattered across the ground, some still burning, some already cold and dead like the rest of the ship around me. I was lying half under a broken piece of the hull, my leg pinned beneath a twisted bar of metal. Above me, tall black trees stood like watching giants, their branches swaying, though there was no wind. I tried to remember what happened. The memories came in broken pieces. An alarm, a voice from the pilot's seat, shouting a word I did not understand, a flash of white light. Then nothing, until this pain. I called out with my mind first, the way my people do, reaching for the others on my crew. Nothing answered. I called again, pushing harder, ignoring how much it hurt to concentrate. Still nothing. Either they were too far, or they were no longer able to answer at all. I did not let myself finish that second thought. My name is Kai. That is not my full name, but it is the short version, easier for outsiders to say. I am a scout, a reader of new worlds, sent ahead of my people to study places before anyone else sets foot on them. I had studied 31 planets before this one. I had never once been hurt this badly on any of them. This moon was supposed to be empty. Our scans said no large life, no dangerous atmosphere, no reason for concern. Scans are not always right. I looked down at my leg. The metal bar had not cut through the skin, but the bone underneath was clearly broken, bent at an angle no leg should ever bend. My people are not built for injuries like this. Our bones are light, made for speed and grace, not for taking hits. A wound like this on a human, I would later learn, might be painful but survivable with rest. On me, it was something closer to a death sentence, especially with night coming and the temperature already dropping. I am from a warm world. Cold is not just uncomfortable for my kind, it is dangerous. Our bodies begin shutting down long before a human would even reach for a coat. I could already feel it, a heaviness creeping into my fingers, my breath turning shallow. I tried to pull my leg free. The pain was so sharp that the light on my skin flared bright white for a moment, and I had to stop, panting, my whole body shaking. I tried again anyway. I did not have the luxury of stopping. The forest around me was already changing. The rust-colored sky was fading toward a deep violet, and with the fading light came new sounds. Something clicked, far off at first, then closer. Not a machine sound. A living sound, sharp and rhythmic, like claws tapping on stone. I went very still. My scanner had melted in the crash, so I had no way to identify what was making that sound. I only knew, in the way every living thing knows danger, that it was hunting. I thought about my training. Stay calm, assess the threat, signal for help if possible. I tried the last one first, reaching into the wreckage beside me with my good arm, searching for the small communicator unit that should have survived even if everything else did not. My fingers found it half buried in ash. I pulled it free and pressed the small light on its side. Nothing happened. I pressed it again, harder, my hand shaking. Still nothing. The casing was cracked down the middle, and when I turned it over, I could see the inside was scorched black. It was as dead as the ship around me. For the first time since I woke, I let myself understand the full shape of my situation. No working communicator, no crew answering my call, a broken leg trapping me in place, a cold night arriving fast, and somewhere in the trees something moving closer with every passing minute. My people have a saying, passed down from the old scouts who explored strange worlds before any of us were born. They say that fear is not the enemy, hesitation is. Fear only becomes dangerous when it stops you from moving. I tried to hold on to that thought as I dug my fingers into the dirt and pulled myself an inch away from the metal bar pinning my leg, then another inch. Each movement lit sparks of pain up my spine, but I kept going, because staying still felt like giving up, and I was not ready to give up. The clicking sound stopped. I froze completely, listening. Silence can be worse than noise. Silence means something is close enough that it no longer needs to announce itself. A shape moved between two trees at the edge of the clearing. I could not see it clearly in the dying light, only an outline, low to the ground, moving with a strange, careful patience. It was not rushing toward me. It was watching me, the way a hunter watches something wounded, waiting for the right moment. My skin flashed again without my permission, a burst of panicked light across my chest and arms. I tried to control it, knowing that in the wild, light often means one thing to a predator. This is alive, this is prey, this is easy. But I could not stop it. Fear does not ask permission before it shows itself on my skin. The shape took one slow step forward. I searched the ground around me for anything I could use. My fingers closed around a jagged piece of metal from the wreckage, sharp along one edge. It was not much, but it was something. I held it tight, my hand trembling, and waited. The shape stopped at the tree line, its head lifting slightly, as if catching a scent on the air. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the shadows, moving away from me instead of toward me. I did not understand why, and I did not have the strength to wonder for long. Relief hit me so suddenly that my whole body went weak, and the piece of metal slipped from my fingers. Time passed strangely after that. Without my communicator, I had no way to measure it properly. Only the slow crawl of the violet sky turning to full black, dotted with stars I did not recognize. I tried once more to free my leg, working my fingers under the metal bar, pushing with what strength remained in my arms. The bar barely moved, but the pain it caused was enough to make my vision blur at the edges. I stopped, breathing hard, and told myself I would try again in a moment. That moment kept slipping further away. The forest did not stay quiet for long. Other sounds rose to take the place of the clicking creature that had left. A low humming from somewhere in the canopy, a soft rustle of leaves that never seemed to come from wind. Every new sound made my skin flash before I could stop it, small bursts of nervous light that I was certain marked my exact location to anything watching from the dark. I tried pressing my arm against my chest to hide the glow, but my own fear kept betraying me. I thought about the training every young scout receives before their first mission. We are taught to calculate risk, to weigh the odds of survival against the resources available, and to accept, calmly, when the odds turn against us. It is considered a mark of maturity among my people to face an unwinnable situation without panic, to simply understand it and let go. I tried to find that calm. I searched for it the way I might search for a lost object in the dark, patting around inside myself for something solid to hold on to. I did not find it. All I found was the wish, small and stubborn, that I did not want to stop existing on this cold, strange moon, so far from anyone who would ever know what happened to me. The night grew colder. My breathing slowed, and not in a good way. I could feel my body trying to conserve what little warmth it had left, pulling blood away from my hands and feet, dimming the light on my skin until it was barely aglow. I thought of my parents, far away on a warm world, unaware that their daughter was lying broken and alone on a moon nobody had ever properly explored. I thought of my crew, and hoped, without much real hope, that they had survived better than I had. I do not remember deciding to close my eyes. I only remember the cold pulling at me like a slow tide, and the sound of my own heartbeat growing quieter in my ears, and somewhere far off, almost too faint to trust, a new sound cutting through the night. It was not the clicking of claws. It was heavier, steadier, and strange in a way I could not place. Footsteps. Not an animal's footsteps, but something walking upright, pushing through the underbrush, with a kind of clumsy determination that no hunting creature would ever waste energy on. I could not lift my head anymore, but I forced my eyes open one more time, staring toward the trees, wondering if my mind was simply inventing comfort in my final moments. The footsteps grew louder, branches snapped, and then, through the dark, a light appeared, small and white, sweeping across the clearing until it landed directly on me. I heard a voice, low and rough, speaking words I did not understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was not the tone of a predator finding prey. It was the tone of someone who had just found exactly what they were looking for, and was not about to lose it again. The light in my eyes was so bright after the darkness that I flinched, throwing my arm up to block it. A figure stepped closer, tall, wrapped in a heavy jacket, moving in a way that was clumsy compared to the graceful hunters my mind had been dreading all night. He knelt down beside me quickly, dropping a bag onto the ground, and for one terrifying second, I did not know what he was. I had seen images of humans before, back in the briefing files my crew studied before this mission. Grainy pictures, second-hand reports, warnings passed between scouts who had crossed paths with human ships in the wider systems. The stories always said the same things. Humans were unpredictable. Humans took risks no sensible being would take. Humans formed attachments to strangers for reasons that made no logical sense. I had filed all of that away as exaggeration, the kind of story that grows taller every time it is repeated. Now one of them was kneeling in front of me, and I had no idea what to expect. He said something in his language, low and fast, the words tumbling over each other. I could not understand a single one, but I understood the tone. It was worry, plain and unmistakable, the same worry I would expect from one of my own kind finding an injured crewmate. He reached toward my leg, and I flinched back on instinct, a small sound escaping my throat. He stopped immediately, both hands raised, palms open toward me. Even without words, the meaning was clear. I am not going to hurt you. He waited, watching my face, waiting for some sign that it was safe to continue. My skin, exhausted and dim, gave a small pulse of pale blue light despite myself, and something in his expression shifted, like the light had told him something important. He pointed at my leg, then at himself, then made a careful, slow motion with his hands, showing me what he wanted to do before he did it. I understood enough to nod, even though nodding was not a gesture from my own culture. It seemed to translate well enough, because he began working immediately, pulling supplies from the bag beside him. His hands were steady, more steady than I expected from someone whose species was supposedly ruled by emotion rather than logic. He cut away a piece of my torn suit near the injury, careful not to touch the wound directly, and studied the break in my leg with a focus that reminded me of my own instructors back home. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a long, straight piece of metal, along with strips of fabric. I realized, with something between fear and relief, that he intended to set the bone. He looked at me again before starting, and again I saw that same question in his eyes. "Are you ready?" I did not have words to answer him, so I simply held still, bracing myself the way my training had taught me to brace, for pain that could not be avoided. When he moved my leg into position, the pain was sharp enough that my whole body arched upward, and my skin lit up in a burst of white light, bright enough to illuminate the trees around us. I heard him say something under his breath, quick and sympathetic, and then his hand found my shoulder and pressed down gently, not to force me still, but to steady me, the way one might comfort someone during something painful and necessary. It was over faster than I expected. He wrapped the makeshift splint around my leg with quick, practiced movements, tying it firm but not too tight, checking my face after each motion for signs that he had gone too far. Nobody in my culture would have paused so often to check on someone they barely knew. Time is precious in an emergency. Efficiency is valued above almost everything else. Yet here he was, slowing himself down again and again, simply to make sure I was not suffering more than necessary. Once the splint was secure, he sat back on his heels and studied me for a long moment. I studied him too. His face was marked with lines of exhaustion, and there was a fresh scrape along one side of his jaw that looked recent, as if he had pushed through the same underbrush that had slowed me down earlier, only faster and with less care for his own comfort. His breathing was heavier than it should have been for someone simply kneeling on the ground. He had been running. He had been running to reach me before whatever was hunting in these woods found me first. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folded blanket, shaking it open with one hand while keeping the other resting lightly near my good shoulder, as if he expected me to bolt or collapse and wanted to be ready either way. He draped the blanket over me, tucking the edges in around my sides, and I felt something I had almost forgotten in the hours since the crash. Warmth. It should not have surprised me as much as it did. A blanket is a simple object, nothing remarkable, but my mind kept circling back to a single thought. He did not know what I needed. He could not have known how much cold threatened someone of my kind. Not for certain, not without proper knowledge of my biology. Yet he had still chosen warmth as his first gift, as if some instinct told him that whatever this stranded, glowing stranger was, she was cold and needed heat more than anything else. He spoke again, gesturing to himself, then pointing off into the trees in the direction he had come from. I understood the shape of the message even without the words. He needed to get help, or bring back others, or find his own ship. But then something changed in his face, and he stopped mid-gesture, looking down at me, and shook his head instead, a small, firm motion. He was not going to leave. Instead, he began building something around us, dragging fallen branches into a rough half-circle, using pieces of the wrecked shuttle to reinforce the sides, working quickly in the dim light from a small device clipped to his jacket. I watched him from where I lay, too tired and too injured to help, feeling strange and small and grateful in a way I did not have a proper word for in my own language. At one point he paused in his work and pulled a small container from his bag, opening it to reveal a warm, glowing coil inside, something like a portable heater. He placed it close enough to reach me but far enough that it would not scorch the blanket, then checked the direction of the wind, adjusting its position twice before he seemed satisfied. It was such a small, careful thing to notice, the direction of the wind, but it told me more about him than any words could have. The night sounds had not stopped. Somewhere out past the trees, I still heard the low humming and the occasional rustle that did not match any wind pattern. Every time one of those sounds grew louder, he would go still, one hand moving instinctively toward a tool at his belt, positioning his body slightly between me and the sound before relaxing again once it faded. He was protecting me, a creature he had never met, whose language he did not speak, whose biology he likely did not understand, and he was placing himself between me and every threat this moon had to offer, without hesitation, without calculation, without asking what I could offer him in return. I tried to speak, forcing air through my throat despite how raw it felt. The sound that came out was rough and unfamiliar even to my own ears, a few broken syllables in my own language. He leaned closer, clearly trying to catch meaning from the sound the way I had tried to catch it from his earlier words. Neither of us understood the other, not yet, but he nodded anyway, a small, encouraging nod, as if simply hearing me try to speak mattered to him. He touched his own chest and said a short word, slow and clear, repeating it twice. Dane. I understood that this was his name, and something in the simple exchange loosened a knot of fear that had been sitting in my chest since the crash. I touched my own chest in return and said my name back to him, just as slowly. Kai. He repeated it back, close enough that I understood he had caught it, and something like a smile crossed his tired face, brief and small, but real. The wind picked up outside our little shelter of branches and broken metal, carrying the cold deeper into the night. Dane pulled the blanket a little higher over me, checked the heater again, and settled himself at the entrance of our shelter, facing outward toward the trees, watching for danger with the quiet patience of someone who intended to stay awake through every hour of darkness that remained. I wanted to tell him to rest, that he had already done more than enough, that exhaustion could be its own danger out here. But I had no way to say any of it yet, and even if I had, I suspected he would not have listened. At some point in the deep hours of the night, I drifted into something that was not quite sleep, more a gray, floating rest that my body sometimes falls into when it is too tired to stay fully awake, but too alert to let go completely. Every so often I would surface enough to see Dane still sitting at the entrance of our shelter, unmoving, his eyes scanning the tree line. Once I surfaced to find him quietly checking the wrapping on my leg, adjusting it just slightly where it had shifted, his touch light enough that it barely woke me at all. He must have noticed my eyes open, because he offered a small, tired smile before settling back into his watch. Another time I woke to the sound of him moving through the wreckage of my shuttle, careful and quiet, gathering pieces of metal and fabric that could still be useful. He returned with an armful of salvaged material and used it to reinforce the weakest side of our shelter, working by the dim glow of his small handheld light, glancing toward me every few minutes as if to reassure himself that I was still there, still breathing, still safe. I began to notice small things about him in those quiet hours, the way he rationed his own water carefully, taking only the smallest sip before offering the container toward me first, even though I had no clear way yet to explain that my body processed liquid differently than his. The way he kept glancing at a device on his wrist, its light casting a faint green glow across his face, checking it again and again as if hoping it would suddenly show a signal that had not been there moments before. At one point, the wind shifted, carrying a fresh wave of cold air into the shelter, and I saw him shiver, just slightly, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. He had given me the blanket. He had given me the warmth from his portable heater. He had not kept anything extra for himself. I wanted to push the blanket back toward him, to offer some small piece of it in return, but my hands were too weak, and my leg too fragile to move without pain. All I could do was watch him endure the cold in silence, choosing my comfort over his own without a single moment of hesitation. It struck me, lying there in the dark, just how different this was from everything I had been taught to expect. My people are raised to understand cost. Every choice we make is weighed, measured, balanced against what it takes from us and what it gives in return. Helping a stranger who cannot repay you, who may never be able to repay you, who belongs to a species you do not yet understand, is not something my culture considers wise. It is considered inefficient, even reckless. And yet here was a being risking his own comfort, his own rest, possibly his own safety, for someone he had known for only a handful of hours. I found myself wondering what kind of world raised beings like this. What kind of teaching led someone to look at a stranger, injured and unable to offer anything in return, and simply decide, without calculation, that she was worth saving. Toward the last hours before dawn, the temperature dropped further, and despite the portable heater, I felt the cold beginning to seep back into my fingers. My skin dimmed to almost nothing, barely a flicker of pale light. Dane must have noticed, because he moved closer, sitting near enough that his own body heat added something to the small space beneath the blanket, careful not to jostle my splinted leg as he settled beside me. He did not say anything. He simply stayed close, a solid, steady presence against the cold, until I felt my body slowly begin to relax again. I fell into real sleep sometime after that, exhausted enough that even the strange sounds of the forest could not keep me awake any longer. The last thing I remember before the darkness took me fully was the sound of his breathing, slow and even, and the faint, comforting weight of his shoulder resting lightly against mine, keeping watch even as exhaustion pulled at him too. When I woke again, gray light was beginning to filter through the branches above us, and the forest had gone quiet in the particular way that mornings on strange worlds often do, as if even the unknown creatures respected the fragile truce of a new day. Dane was still awake, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, but alert, watching the tree line the same way he had all night. He had not slept at all. The morning brought a strange kind of peace, though I knew it would not last. Dane helped me sit up against a section of the broken hull, careful with my leg, and offered me a piece of dense, dry food from his bag. I did not know if it was safe for my body to process, and from the way he hesitated before handing it over, I guessed he was wondering the same thing. In the end, hunger won out over caution for both of us. I took a small bite, found it strange but harmless, and ate slowly while he watched with quiet relief. It was in the hours that followed that we truly began to understand each other, piece by piece, gesture by gesture. He would point to an object and say its name in his language, waiting for me to repeat it back. I did the same with mine, though I quickly realized his throat could not shape half the sounds my language required. We laughed, in our own ways, at the strange noises that came out when he tried. My people do not laugh with sound the way humans do. We laugh with light, quick rippling patterns across our skin. The first time he saw it happen, his eyes went wide, and then he laughed harder, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and something about hearing that sound eased a tension in my chest that had been there since the crash. We built a small vocabulary between us that morning. Water, cold, pain, help. Simple words first, the ones that mattered most for survival, and slowly, more complicated ones. He taught me the word for friend. I taught him the closest word my language had for the same idea, though ours carries a deeper meaning, something closer to one who stands beside you, when standing beside you costs something. As the day wore on, his exhaustion became harder to hide. He had not slept at all through the night, and I could see it in the slowness of his movements, the way his eyes sometimes lost focus for a moment, before he blinked hard and forced himself back to alertness. I tried to tell him to rest, using the few words we shared, pointing at him and then miming sleep. He shook his head firmly every time, tapping the small device on his wrist and then gesturing toward the trees, meaning I understood that he needed to stay alert until his ship arrived. I asked him, through gestures and the handful of shared words, why he did not simply leave to find higher ground where a signal might reach his ship faster. It would have made sense, from where I sat, for him to prioritize the rescue itself over staying by my side every moment. He seemed to understand the question, because he thought about it for a long moment before answering, mostly with gestures I had to piece together slowly. He pointed to me, then to the trees, then made a sharp cutting motion with his hand, and shook his head. He was telling me that leaving me alone, even for the sake of a faster rescue, was not something he was willing to consider, not with the forest still holding whatever had been hunting the night before. I did not understand it fully in that moment, not the way I would come to understand it later. To my mind, calculated risk should have won out. A faster signal meant a faster rescue for both of us. Leaving me for a short time, if it meant safety sooner, would have been the logical choice by every standard I had been raised with. But logic, I was beginning to learn, was not always the only force that mattered. By midday, his food supply was already running low, most of it given to me in small portions throughout the morning. When I realized this, I tried to refuse the next piece he offered, pushing it gently back toward him, with as much strength as my arm could manage. He simply nudged it back toward me, more firmly this time, with a look on his face that needed no translation. Eat. I asked him, through broken gestures, why he was not eating enough for himself. He patted his own stomach and then made a motion I eventually understood to mean that he was fine, that he had more reserves than I did, that my body needed the food more urgently than his. I did not fully believe it, not from the way his hands had begun to tremble slightly by early afternoon, but I understood that arguing would not change his mind. The peace of the morning did not last through the day. In the early afternoon, the humming sound from the night before returned, closer now, moving through the underbrush with a rustling, deliberate pace. Dane went still immediately, his hand moving to the tool at his belt, positioning himself between me and the sound before I had even fully registered what was happening. A shape emerged from the tree line, larger than the one I had seen the night before, moving low to the ground with the same patient, hunting posture. Its skin, or perhaps scales, shimmered faintly in the daylight, a mottled gray-green that blended almost perfectly with the surrounding brush. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, studying us both with eyes that reflected the light in an unsettling way. Dane did not run. He did not hesitate. He picked up a length of metal from the wreckage, one he had clearly set aside earlier for exactly this purpose, and moved forward, away from me, drawing the creature's attention toward himself instead of toward where I lay helpless against the broken hull. I tried to call out, though I had no words yet that would mean anything to him, only a sharp burst of light across my skin, flashing bright with fear on his behalf. He glanced back at me for only a moment, and in that glance I saw something steady and certain, a decision already made and not open for reconsideration. The creature lunged. Dane moved sideways, faster than I expected from someone who had not slept in over a day, swinging the metal length in a wide arc that caught the creature along its side. It shrieked, a high grating sound, and staggered back, but did not retreat. It circled him instead, testing, searching for an opening. I watched, helpless, unable to do anything but flash warnings across my skin that meant nothing to either of them, as Dane fought a creature nearly twice his size with nothing but a scavenged piece of metal and sheer refusal to let it pass him. The creature lunged again, and this time one of its limbs caught his arm, tearing through the fabric of his jacket and leaving a shallow but bleeding line across his skin. He did not cry out. He barely reacted at all, adjusting his grip on the metal length and driving it forward again, forcing the creature back another step. The fight felt endless, though it likely lasted only a few minutes. Dane took another glancing hit along his shoulder, staggering slightly but never falling, never giving ground toward where I lay. Each time the creature pressed forward, he met it, placing his own body as the wall between danger and me, absorbing hits that could easily have been avoided if he had simply stepped aside and let the creature choose a different path, toward the wreckage, toward anything other than himself. Finally, with a burst of effort that seemed to come from somewhere beyond simple physical strength, he drove the metal length forward hard enough to send the creature stumbling back into the tree line. It let out one last shriek, glaring at us both for a long moment, before turning and disappearing into the brush the way it had come. Dane stood there for a moment, breathing hard, blood running freely down his arm from the tear in his jacket, before he finally turned back toward me, some of the tension leaving his shoulders now that the immediate danger had passed. He walked back slowly, favoring his uninjured side slightly, and knelt down beside me again, checking on my leg first, before even glancing at his own wounds. I reached out, ignoring the pain in my own body, and touched the torn fabric near his arm, my meaning clear even without words. "Let me see." He hesitated only briefly before allowing it, pulling the fabric aside enough to reveal the cut beneath, longer than I had first thought, though not deep enough to be truly dangerous. I understood, in that moment, something my culture had never properly explained to me despite all my training. This was not recklessness. This was not the poor risk calculation the old briefing files had warned me about. This was a choice, made clearly and deliberately, every single time danger appeared, to place his own body between harm and someone he had known for less than a full day. He cleaned the wound himself, using supplies from his bag, wrapping it with quick, practiced movements despite the trembling in his hands from exhaustion and adrenaline. I tried to help where I could, holding the wrapping steady with my good hand while he tied it off, and for a moment, working together in silence, something passed between us that needed no shared language at all. As the afternoon wore into evening, we continued building our small vocabulary, though the mood between us had shifted into something quieter, more serious. I asked him, through careful gestures and the handful of words we now shared, why he had done it, why risk himself so completely for a stranger from another world, someone whose language he barely spoke, whose culture he did not understand, who had nothing obvious to offer him in return. He thought about the question for a long time before answering, and when he did, his response came slowly, piece by piece, using every word we had built together that day. He pointed to me, then to himself, then made a motion with his hand, flat and level, moving between us both. Equal. He was telling me, as clearly as our limited words allowed, that in his understanding, a life was a life, regardless of where it began or what shape it took. There was no calculation to be made. There was no version of the choice where leaving me had ever truly been an option. I did not have an answer for that. My whole life, every lesson I had ever learned, every careful weighing of cost against benefit that my people valued so highly, none of it had prepared me for someone who simply refused to calculate at all. Night began falling again, faster than I wanted it to, and with it came the same creeping cold from before. Dane checked the portable heater, adjusted the blanket around me, and settled back into his post at the entrance of our shelter, his injured arm held slightly close to his body, his eyes still scanning the tree line with the same tireless patience he had shown from the very first moment he found me. I watched him for a long while in the dim light, thinking about everything the old scouts had warned us about humans, all the stories about their instability, their reckless emotion, their strange, unpredictable choices. None of it matched what I had seen. What I had seen was steadiness. What I had seen was sacrifice given freely, without hesitation, without any expectation of return. As the hours passed, I found myself wanting to know more about him, not just the words for water and cold and pain, but who he actually was, back wherever his ship called home. Using gestures and the growing handful of words between us, I asked about his crew. His face softened at the question, and he held up fingers to show a small number, then pointed toward the sky in the direction his ship would eventually come from. He mimed a few quick impressions of the others. A tall figure with crossed arms, meant, I guessed, to be someone stern and serious, and then a shorter figure moving quickly, hands waving, meant to be someone lively and talkative. Each impression made him smile, small and tired but genuine, and I understood that whatever crew waited for him out there, he cared for them deeply. I asked, as best I could, if this was something his people did often, risking themselves for strangers of other worlds. He considered the question longer than any before it, and when he answered, his gestures were slower, more deliberate, as if he wanted to be sure I understood correctly. He pointed to his own chest, then swept his hand outward, toward me, toward the trees, toward the sky, a gesture that seemed to mean everyone, not just his own kind. Then he shook his head slightly and tapped his chest again, correcting himself. It was not something his people did as a rule, handed down and enforced. It was something he did, something he believed, and from the way he said it, I understood that not every human shared this belief the same way, but enough of them did that it had shaped the world he came from into something my people had never properly understood. The evening deepened, and my strength continued to fade in ways that worried me more than I let show. My skin, usually capable of holding a steady glow even in rest, had dimmed to something barely visible, a faint pulse instead of a light. Dane noticed, of course. He had noticed every small change in me since the first hour we met, and he moved closer again, checking the heater, adjusting the blanket, pressing the back of his hand lightly against my arm the way he might check a fever in one of his own kind. Whatever he felt there made his frown deepen, and he glanced toward the sky again, searching for a sign of his ship that had not yet come. We did not speak much after that, both of us settling into a tired, watchful quiet as true night fell fully over the forest. I drifted in and out of that same shallow, half-aware rest from the night before, and each time I surfaced, I found him still awake, still watching, his injured arm held carefully against his side, refusing to let exhaustion win even after everything his body had already endured. At one point deep in the night, I surfaced to find him pressing something small and warm into my hand, a strip of the dense food from earlier, the last of what remained in his bag. I tried to push it back, knowing he had eaten almost nothing himself through the entire day, but his hand closed gently over mine, holding it there, insistent and immovable. I ate it slowly, watching him in the dim light, and understood without needing words that he would go hungry through the rest of the night before he allowed the same for me. Somewhere out in the darkness, his ship was still searching, and somewhere deep inside myself, a belief I had carried my entire life was quietly beginning to come apart. A distant sound woke me fully sometime before dawn, a low mechanical hum that was nothing like the living sounds of the forest. Dane heard it too, his head snapping up, eyes wide with something between hope and disbelief. He scrambled to his feet, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured arm, and stared up through the gaps in the canopy toward the sky. Light swept across the treetops, distant but unmistakable, moving in the slow, searching pattern of a rescue craft. Dane grabbed the small device from his wrist and pressed it rapidly, sending out whatever signal it still had the power to send. For a long, breathless moment, nothing changed. Then the lights shifted direction, turning toward us, growing brighter as the craft descended through the canopy. Relief flooded through me so suddenly that my skin lit up bright, a wash of pale blue across my whole body, brighter than it had managed since the crash. Dane laughed, a short, exhausted sound, and looked down at me with something like triumph in his tired eyes. But the moon was not finished with us yet. As the rescue craft dropped lower, its engines stirred the branches above into a violent shaking, and with a groan that seemed to come from the ground itself, the section of hull we had been sheltering against began to shift. I felt it before I understood what was happening, a slow tilt beneath the broken metal, the ground softer than it should have been after 2 days of settling weight and buried wreckage. Dane understood first. He grabbed my good arm and pulled, hard, dragging me away from the shelter just as the hull section collapsed inward with a crash of metal and dirt, exactly where I had been lying only a moment before. Dust and debris rose around us, and for a moment I could not see anything at all, only feel Dane's arm locked around me, pulling me further from the collapsing ground. The rescue craft's lights swung wildly, its pilot clearly startled by the sudden collapse below, struggling to find stable ground to land on. Dane shouted something upward, his voice raw, and half-carried, half-dragged me toward a clearer patch of ground a short distance away, moving faster than his exhausted body should have allowed. The forest, disturbed by the noise and light, was waking up around us in the worst possible way. The humming sound returned, louder now, joined by others, as if the commotion had drawn every creature within hearing distance toward the source of the disturbance. Shapes moved at the edges of my vision, low and fast, circling closer as the craft continued its unstable descent. Dane set me down as gently as speed allowed in the clearer patch of ground, positioning himself immediately between me and the tree line, his injured arm hanging slightly useless at his side, but his stance still solid, still ready. The rescue craft's landing lights swept across us, and a door on its side began to open, a ramp extending down toward the ground, even as the vehicle continued adjusting for stable footing on the uneven terrain. A voice called out from the craft, urgent and sharp, and I saw a figure appear at the top of the ramp, waving frantically for us to hurry. Dane bent down and scooped me up properly this time, ignoring what must have been agonizing pain in his wounded arm, and began moving toward the ramp as fast as his exhausted legs could carry him. The shapes in the tree line grew bolder, drawn by the noise and the scent of blood still fresh on his jacket from the fight the day before. One broke from the cover of the trees entirely, moving fast across the clearing, and Dane turned his body instinctively, shielding me with his own frame as he kept moving toward the ramp, each step a battle against exhaustion and pain. Something struck his leg from behind, a glancing blow that sent him stumbling, though he somehow kept his footing, refusing to let go of me even as he fought to stay upright. The figure at the top of the ramp shouted again, and I heard the sharp crack of something firing from the craft, aimed at the creature now circling behind us, driving it back just enough to buy the seconds we needed. Dane reached the base of the ramp and did not hesitate. He lifted me up first, passing me into the arms of the figure waiting there, a woman with sharp eyes and quick hands who pulled me aboard without a moment's pause. Only once I was fully inside did Dane turn back to pull himself up after me, and it was in that final motion that I saw him falter, his injured leg finally giving out beneath him. He caught himself on the edge of the ramp, one hand gripping the metal rail, the other pressed against his side, where I now saw a fresh line of red beginning to spread across his jacket, hidden until this moment beneath the chaos of our escape. The woman shouted something and reached down, grabbing his arm and hauling him the rest of the way aboard, just as the ramp began retracting, sealing shut against the forest and its circling shapes. The craft lurched upward almost immediately, engines roaring as it fought to clear the canopy, and I felt the whole vehicle shudder as it broke free of the branches and rose into open sky. Only then, with the immediate danger finally behind us, did Dane allow himself to collapse fully, sliding down against the wall of the craft, his breathing ragged, his face pale beneath the dirt and exhaustion of the last 2 days. The woman who had pulled us both aboard knelt quickly beside him, calling out names I did not recognize yet, and within moments more figures appeared, moving with the practiced speed of people who had done this before, cutting away his jacket to properly examine the wound at his side. I lay where I had been set down, my own pain and exhaustion suddenly overwhelming now that the adrenaline of the escape was fading, and watched as they worked over him with quiet, focused urgency. He caught my eye once, through the movement of hands and instruments around him, and even through the clear pain on his face, he managed something like a smile, small and crooked, as if to tell me it was fine, that everything had worked out exactly the way it was supposed to. I wanted to tell him that nothing about this had needed to happen the way it did, that he could have reached the ramp faster, could have saved himself the injury to his leg and the deeper wound at his side, if only he had let go of me even a moment sooner, if only he had prioritized his own safety over mine even once during those final desperate seconds. But I understood, even as the thought formed, that asking him to do so would have been asking him to become someone entirely different from who he was. More of the crew gathered around us in those first chaotic minutes aboard the craft, and though I did not yet know their names, I could read the shape of their concern clearly enough. A tall man with quick, careful hands moved straight to the medical supplies, calling out instructions to the others while he worked. A shorter woman with dark hair pulled back tight knelt beside me, checking my splint and murmuring something soft, the kind of tone that needed no translation to understand as reassurance. Another crew member, younger, stood near the door they had just sealed, still breathing hard from whatever weapon he had fired at the creature outside, watching the two of us with wide, shaken eyes, as if only now processing how close the rescue had come to going wrong. The woman with dark hair, the one who had pulled us both aboard, kept glancing between Dane and the instruments in her hands, her jaw tight with the particular kind of anger that only comes from deep worry. She said something sharp to him, and even without understanding the words, I recognized the tone completely. It was the tone of someone furious at a person they loved for taking a risk far greater than it needed to be. Dane, even through his exhaustion, managed a small, guilty smile in response. The smile of someone who knew exactly what he had done and would likely do it again without a second thought if the same choice ever came before him. The crew worked over him for a long while, cleaning and closing the wound at his side, checking the leg that had taken the glancing blow during our escape. I drifted in and out of my own hazy awareness, someone eventually kneeling beside me too, checking my splinted leg with careful, unfamiliar hands, speaking softly in words I still did not understand, but whose intent was clear enough. At some point, the craft leveled out into steady, smooth flight, and the frantic energy of the rescue slowly gave way to something calmer. I turned my head enough to see Dane resting against the wall of the craft, his side properly bandaged now, his leg elevated and wrapped, his eyes closed, finally allowing himself the rest he had refused for 2 full days. The woman who had pulled us both aboard settled nearby, watching him with an expression that mixed relief and quiet exasperation, the look of someone who cared for him deeply and had likely scolded him for exactly this kind of recklessness more than once before. She caught me watching and offered a tired, warm smile of her own, gesturing toward him and then toward me, a question in her eyes that needed no translation. Is she the reason? She introduced herself slowly, tapping her own chest the way Dane had done back in the forest. Nora. Then she pointed to the tall man who had handled the medical supplies. Owen. And the younger crew member still standing near the door, his hands not quite steady yet from the encounter outside. Ben. I repeated each name back as best my throat allowed, and each of them offered a small nod or smile in return, as if the simple act of learning my attempt at their names meant something to them. Nora checked the readings on a small device near my leg, comparing them to something on a screen built into the wall of the craft, her brow furrowing in concentration. She said something to Owen, quick and clipped, and he nodded, moving to adjust the temperature controls somewhere near where I lay. Within moments I felt the air around me grow warmer, and I understood that somehow, without any shared language between us, they had already guessed enough about my biology to know that cold was the true danger threatening me, not simply my leg. I looked over at Dane again, watching as Owen finished securing the bandage at his side, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest as exhaustion finally claimed him fully, his eyes closing in real sleep for the first time since he had found me in that clearing. Nora rested a hand lightly on his shoulder before standing, checking on me once more, and then moving off to help the others settle the craft into a steady course, back toward wherever they called home. I did not have the words yet to explain everything that had happened in that forest. The crash, the cold, the fear, the strange and steady presence that had refused to leave my side through all of it. All I could do was look at Dane, resting now after 2 days of giving everything he had for a stranger from another world, and let my skin answer for me, glowing soft and warm and grateful in the dim light of the craft, a color and pattern that meant, in my language, something very close to the word he had taught me the day before. Friend. The days that followed passed in a blur of healing and quiet discovery. The ship, a modest vessel called the Harrow's Reach, was smaller than the transports my own people used for long journeys, but it felt warmer somehow, full of voices and movement and the easy laughter of a crew that clearly trusted each other completely. Owen turned out to be their medic, and he checked on my leg twice a day, comparing his findings each time to notes he kept in a worn datapad, slowly learning the particulars of my biology through careful observation rather than any existing record. Nora, I learned, served as the ship's pilot and second in command, sharp-tongued but endlessly patient when it came to helping me learn new words. Ben, the youngest of them, visited often with simple curiosity, asking questions about my world through the growing bridge of language Dane and I had already built, questions I found myself eager to answer. Dane recovered slower than the rest of us expected, the wound at his side deeper than it had first appeared, requiring him to rest far longer than his own stubbornness wanted to allow. Owen scolded him more than once for trying to get up too soon, and each time, Dane accepted the scolding with the same crooked, unbothered smile he had given Nora back on the moon, the smile of someone who understood the risk he had taken and considered it worth every bit of the recovery it now demanded. I spent much of my own recovery in the small medical bay beside him, our two makeshift beds close enough that we could talk through the long hours of healing. Our shared vocabulary grew quickly now that we had time and safety on our side, no longer limited to simple words for danger and comfort, but stretching into deeper conversation. I learned about his home, a place with wide green fields and old stone buildings, a family who worried about him every time he left on missions like this one. He learned about mine, the warm coastal cities of my people, the long formal traditions we followed, the careful, calculated way we were taught to move through the universe. It was during one of these conversations that I finally found the words to properly explain what his actions meant to my people, and what I now intended to do because of them. My culture holds an old tradition, older than most of our current customs, called the life debt. When someone saves another from near certain death, especially at great personal cost, the one who was saved carries a formal, lasting obligation to the one who saved them. It is not simply gratitude, it is a binding promise, recognized across our entire society, that the debt will be repaid in full, whatever form that repayment eventually takes. I explained this to Dane as carefully as my growing vocabulary allowed, sitting up in my medical bed, my leg finally beginning to heal properly under Owen's careful attention. I told him that by the customs of my people, I now owed him a life debt, formally and completely, and that I intended to honor it the proper way, through a ritual pledge spoken before witnesses. Dane listened to the whole explanation with a strange expression on his face, somewhere between confusion and mild alarm, and when I finished, he shook his head slowly, waving one hand in the same dismissive gesture I had already come to recognize from him. He told me, piecing his response together with the patience he had shown from the very first night, that where he came from, saving someone did not require anything in return. It was not a transaction, it was not a debt to be tracked and eventually repaid. It was simply what you did when you found someone in trouble, and expecting anything back would have changed the meaning of the act entirely, turned it into something closer to a trade than an act of care. I tried to explain that my people did not see it as a burden, that the life debt was considered an honor, a formal acknowledgement of a bond too significant to leave unspoken. But Dane only shrugged, his eyes warm despite his exhaustion, and told me that if I truly wanted to repay him for anything, the only repayment he would ever ask for was simple: stay safe, live well. That was enough for him. I found myself strangely moved by his refusal, more moved than I might have been if he had simply accepted my formal pledge the way tradition expected. There was something in his casual dismissal of the very idea of debt that told me more about who he was than any amount of ceremony ever could have. He had not saved me because he calculated some future benefit. He had not saved me expecting a formal bond in return. He had simply seen someone in danger and acted, without needing any deeper reason beyond that simple fact. Still, I made my pledge anyway, quietly, in my own language, speaking the old words my people use when a debt like this is formed, even though Dane could not understand most of what I said. I did it not because he asked for it, but because I needed to say it, needed my own heart to hear the words spoken aloud, a promise to myself as much as to him. When I finished, he simply reached over and rested his hand lightly on my arm, the same steady, grounding touch he had offered on that first terrible night in the forest, and told me, in the plain words of his own language, that whatever I called it, he was glad I was alive to say it. As my leg continued healing under Owen's care, and as Dane slowly regained his strength, I found myself facing a question I had not expected to face when this mission first began. My original assignment had been simple: scout the moon, gather data, return to my people with a report. That mission had ended the moment my shuttle crashed, replaced by something far larger than any report could ever capture. I thought often about the briefing files my crew had studied before this journey, the warnings about human recklessness, human instability, human choices that made no sense by any reasonable measure. Every single one of those warnings had proven hollow against the reality I had actually lived through. What I had witnessed instead was a steadiness beyond anything my own culture prepared its scouts to expect, a willingness to give everything for a stranger, simply because that stranger needed help, with no accounting of cost, no calculation of return. I began to understand that my people's warnings had not been entirely wrong, only incomplete. Humans did take risks that seemed, by our standards, poorly calculated. But the reason was not instability. The reason was that they measured the value of a choice differently than we did. Where my people asked, "Is this worth the cost?" humans seemed to ask a different question entirely. "Is this someone who needs help?" If the answer was yes, the cost rarely seemed to matter at all. I spoke with Nora about this one evening, as she checked the ship's course toward the nearest station, where proper reports would need to be filed about the crash and the rescue. She listened to my halting attempt to explain what I had come to understand, and when I finished, she smiled, a knowing, gentle smile, and told me that most of the crew had learned some version of the same lesson from Dane at one point or another. He was, by her own description, the kind of person who made the rest of them better simply by refusing to accept easy excuses for looking away from someone in trouble. Before that decision fully formed, the Harrow's Reach reached a small trading station along the edge of the frontier, a place where proper reports about the crash needed to be filed and where news of my survival could finally be sent back toward my own people. Nora helped me draft the report in careful official language, though I found myself leaving out the deeper truth of what I had experienced, saving that part for a message of my own, one I intended to send separately, in my own words, once I had found the right way to say it. Walking through the station for the first time since the crash, still favoring my healing leg, I saw humans in far greater numbers than I ever had before, moving through the crowded corridors with the same easy confidence Dane carried, laughing loudly, arguing over small things, helping strangers with directions or heavy cargo without a second thought. I watched an older man help a young child who had dropped a bag of belongings, kneeling down to gather the scattered items without being asked, and I found myself wondering how many small moments like this happened every single day across human worlds, unremarkable to them, extraordinary to someone raised the way I had been raised. Dane walked beside me through the station, still moving carefully due to his healing side, pointing out small details of station life the way a guide might, clearly enjoying the chance to show me more of his world now that we shared enough language to make it meaningful. He introduced me to station workers, to other travelers, to anyone willing to stop and listen, each time explaining my presence with the same simple, unbothered honesty. She got hurt. We helped. No embellishment, no expectation of praise, simply a statement of what had happened, as though it required no further justification. I noticed, too, how others reacted to this explanation. Nobody questioned why he had helped a stranger from another world. Nobody asked what he expected to gain from it. The reaction was always some version of quiet approval, a nod, a small smile, as though helping without expectation was so deeply woven into their culture that it barely needed acknowledging at all. It was, I realized, simply the water they swam in, invisible to them precisely because it was everywhere. We returned to the ship that evening, and it was over a quiet meal shared among the whole crew that Ben finally asked the question I suspected had been sitting with all of them since the rescue. He asked, through Dane's careful translation, whether my own people would have done the same for a stranger in similar circumstances. I did not answer immediately, turning the question over honestly in my mind before speaking. I told them the truth, as gently as I could manage. My people would have calculated the odds first. They would have weighed the risk to the rescuer against the chance of the rescued surviving regardless, and if the numbers did not favor a clean, low-cost rescue, it was entirely possible that no one would have come at all, or that whoever found me might have simply reported my presence and moved on, waiting for a proper recovery team equipped for the specific risks involved, even if that wait cost me my life. The table went quiet after that, not from judgment, I understood, but from a kind of sober recognition of how differently our two peoples measured the value of a single life. Owen finally broke the silence, saying quietly that it was not really so different from choices some humans made too, that not every person from his world would have acted the way Dane had. But Dane, chewing thoughtfully, shook his head and said that even if not every human would run into danger the way he had, most of them, when it came down to the moment itself, standing right in front of someone who needed help, would find it very difficult to simply walk away. I thought about that distinction for a long while afterward. It was not that humans lacked the capacity for calculation entirely. It was that when the moment actually arrived, when a living being stood in front of them, hurting and afraid, something in them refused to let cold calculation win. My people calculated first and felt second. Humans, it seemed, felt first, and only sorted through the calculation afterward, if at all. By the time my leg had healed enough to walk carefully on my own, and Dane's side had healed enough that Owen finally stopped scolding him for moving too quickly, I had made a decision that surprised even myself. I approached Nora, the ship's second-in-command, and asked, through words that were now far more fluent than the broken gestures of those first desperate hours, whether it might be possible for me to remain aboard the Harrow's Reach, at least for a while longer, to properly study the culture that had produced someone like Dane. Nora considered the request seriously, glancing toward Dane, who sat nearby pretending not to listen while clearly listening to every word. She told me it would need to be cleared through proper channels, official permissions and paperwork that even a small independent crew like theirs could not entirely avoid. But she also told me, with a small warm smile, that as far as she was concerned, I was welcome to stay for exactly as long as I wanted. Dane, when I finally turned to him directly, simply shrugged in that same easy way he always did, as if the answer had never been in any real doubt. Of course you can stay. Where else would you go? I thought about my own people then, far away on their warm coastal world, still believing the old warnings about human recklessness, still teaching young scouts to calculate the cost of every kindness before offering it. I thought about how different my own life might have turned out if I had never crashed on that cold, dangerous moon, if I had never met a stranger willing to give everything for someone who could offer him nothing in return. I decided, in that quiet moment aboard the Harrow's Reach, that I owed it to my people to tell them the truth about what I had learned, not through some formal report filled with careful, measured language, but through my own continued presence among the very people they had misunderstood for so long. I would study them properly, learn their language fully, understand the deeper shape of the belief that made someone like Dane act the way he did, and eventually, when the time was right, carry that understanding back to my own world. For now, though, I was content simply to heal, to learn, and to sit beside the human who had found me broken and alone in the dark, and had refused, at every single turn, to leave me that way. The stars outside the viewport of the Harrow's Reach stretched on endlessly, the same stars I had once studied as simply another set of coordinates on a scouting mission, now carrying a different weight entirely. Somewhere among them was the cold, dangerous moon where I had nearly died, and somewhere among them, too, was the beginning of everything I now understood about the strange, stubborn, endlessly generous species that called itself human. I did not know yet exactly what my future would hold, whether my people would listen when I finally tried to explain what I had learned, or whether the old warnings were too deeply rooted to be undone by a single scout's changed heart. But I knew, watching Dane laugh quietly with Ben over some small joke I had not yet learned enough of the language to understand, that I would not trade this new understanding for anything my old life had offered. He had found me injured and alone, with nothing left to offer him in return, and he had chosen to help anyway, simply because that was who he was. In doing so, he had given me something far larger than rescue. He had given me a reason to see the universe differently, and a debt I intended to spend the rest of my life trying to properly understand, even if he himself would always insist there was never any debt to begin with.